The room wasn't loud. That was the first thing people would remember later. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above a long conference table. Coffee cups sat untouched. Chairs scraped once, then went still. At the far end of the room, a worker stood with his hands folded in front of him, shoulders straight, eyes calm. He had been waiting for his turn to speak. It never came. A man in a tailored jacket glanced at him, then looked away as if the worker were part of the furniture. "Let's move on," he said, waving a hand. "We don't need that input right now." A few people shifted in their seats. Someone exhaled through their nose, a quiet laugh that wasn't meant to be cruel, but was. Another person avoided eye contact altogether. The worker didn't react. He didn't clear his throat. Didn't protest. Didn't defend himself. He simply nodded once, slow and respectful, as if accepting a verdict that hadn't needed evidence. The man in the jacket smiled, thin and satisfied. "Good," he added, louder now. "I like it when people know their place." The words hung there, polite enough to deny, sharp enough to wound. The worker's jaw tightened for half a second. His fingers curled slightly against his palm, then relaxed. His gaze dropped to the floor, not in shame, but in calculation. Anyone watching closely would have noticed that. No one did. Around the table, pens tapped. Phones buzzed. The meeting rolled on, as if something important hadn't just been taken from him in plain sight. And still, he said nothing. Because silence, when chosen, can be dangerous. And because sometimes, the most powerful response is not immediate. It waits. What no one in that room understood, what no one even thought to ask, was why a man who had just been publicly diminished stood there so calmly, as if the insult hadn't landed. Or as if he knew exactly when to speak. And exactly what one sentence could do. Before the story continues, tell us where you're watching from. Comment your city or country if you believe respect should never depend on power, status, or skin color. And stay with this story, because what comes next proves that silence isn't surrender. The worker's name rarely came up in conversation. Not because he was invisible, but because he made things run smoothly enough that no one questioned how. He arrived early. Left late. Fixed problems before they turned into complaints. When something went wrong, he took responsibility even when it wasn't his fault. Especially then. He wasn't new to the job. Or the system. Years of discipline showed in the way he stood, the way he listened more than he spoke. He dressed simply. Clean boots. Pressed shirt. No flash. No performance. Just quiet consistency. The kind that makes supervisors comfortable and nervous at the same time. Because men like him don't break easily. Still, over time, the tone around him shifted. Instructions that were once requests became orders. Questions turned into tests. Praise disappeared, replaced by phrases like "you should already know this" or "let's not overthink things." Always said with a smile. Always in front of others. He noticed the pattern long before anyone else did. Meetings where he wasn't invited. Decisions made without him, then blamed on him. His work scrutinized while others' mistakes were quietly corrected behind closed doors. When he spoke, someone talked over him. When he stayed quiet, it was used against him. Too passive. Not leadership material. Doesn't push back. The irony was heavy. He knew it. He carried it without complaint. What the room didn't see were the stakes waiting just beneath the surface. This job wasn't just a paycheck. It paid for a child's tuition. Covered medical bills. Kept a promise he'd made years ago, to never let his family feel unstable again. Losing it wouldn't just hurt his pride. It would ripple outward. And the people applying pressure knew that. That was the leverage. So when subtle disrespect showed up, he absorbed it. When his name was used as an example of what not to do, he nodded. When jokes landed a little too close to insult, he didn't flinch. Silence became his armor. But silence has weight. Every time he was cut off mid-sentence, it stacked. Every time someone else took credit for his work, it stacked. Every sideways glance, every sigh, every dismissive wave, it stacked. And now, standing in that room, hands folded, eyes lowered, he could feel it all pressing down at once. They thought they were watching a man being diminished. What they were actually watching was someone choosing restraint over reaction. Because there are moments when speaking too early costs everything. And moments, rare ones, when waiting changes the balance of power completely. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. At first, it was procedural. A new approval rule slipped into place, one that somehow applied only to his work. Forms that had never required signatures suddenly needed 3. Deadlines moved without notice, then were enforced as if they had always existed. When he asked for clarification, the response was calm and rehearsed. Let's not make this complicated. Or worse, are you saying you can't handle it? He nodded. Adjusted. Stayed late. Around him, the room learned something dangerous: silence could be used. By the second month, the tone shifted from oversight to performance. Comments became public. Not confrontational, never that. Just loud enough. Let's use this as a learning moment, the man in the tailored jacket said once, leaning back in his chair. Some people struggle with initiative. Eyes turned. Not accusing. Curious. The worker stood there, papers in hand, absorbing the words like rain on stone. He could feel heat rising in his neck. He swallowed it. A pen clicked twice. Someone shifted uncomfortably. No one objected. That was the first mini-test. The next came a week later. A report went missing. Or so they said. The worker was called into a meeting with no notice, no agenda. The room was smaller this time. The door closed softly behind him. We're concerned, the jacketed man began, folding his hands. About reliability. The word landed heavier than it should have. The worker asked one question. Calm. Direct. Can you show me where it was logged? The answer was a pause. Then a smile. Then, let's not get defensive. He understood then. This wasn't about the report. From that day forward, people spoke around him. Decisions were announced, not discussed. When something succeeded, it was teamwork. When something failed, it was his responsibility. Subtle glances followed him through hallways. Conversation stopped when he entered. Once, as he walked past the break room, he heard his name. Followed by laughter. He didn't slow down. Didn't turn his head. But his hand clenched once at his side, tight enough for the knuckles to pale. He released it before anyone could notice. By the third month, the threats arrived, dressed as concern. You know budgets are tight, someone said casually. Positions are always being evaluated, said another. People who don't adapt tend to struggle, the jacketed man added, eyes never leaving his screen. The worker listened. Memorized every word. Every tone shift. Every pause. Then came the public challenge. A quarterly review. Full attendance. Senior staff seated in a neat line, as if arranged for effect. The worker stood near the screen while numbers were projected behind him, numbers he recognized. These projections don't align, the jacketed man said, tapping the table. Can you explain that? The worker glanced at the screen. He could. Easily. The explanation was simple, documented, verified. He opened his mouth. Briefly, the man added, cutting him off. We don't need a lecture. A ripple moved through the room. A suppressed cough. Someone's foot tapping too fast. The worker nodded once. Delivered the explanation in 2 sentences. Clear. Precise. Silence followed. Then the jacketed man leaned back. That's your interpretation. The word interpretation stripped the truth of its authority. Another mini spike. Another layer added. Later that day, an email went out. Company-wide. It referenced ongoing performance concerns without naming anyone. But everyone knew. The worker read it twice. Closed his laptop. Sat still. That night, at home, he reviewed documents he hadn't looked at in years. Not out of fear, but confirmation. He moved slowly, deliberately. When he finished, he didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply slept. The next week, the escalation sharpened. A compliance issue was raised, minor, technical, easily correctable. Except it was framed as serious. A meeting was scheduled with external observers present. People who didn't know the history. People who would take cues from whoever spoke with confidence. The worker arrived early. Sat straight. Hands folded. The jacketed man arrived late. Apologized loudly. Took control immediately. "We're here because standards matter," he said. "And accountability matters." Eyes turned toward the worker. A question was asked, not to him, but about him. Another followed. Then another. Each framed carefully. Each suggestion hovering just short of accusation. The worker waited. When it was finally his turn, he spoke evenly. Facts only. No emotion. No defense beyond the truth itself. The response came instantly. "This isn't about feelings," the jacketed man said. "This is about trust." Trust. The word was weaponized now. The room grew quiet. Uncomfortable. A few people shifted. Someone stared at the table as if it might open and swallow them. And still, no one intervened. That was when the final insult arrived. Not shouted. Not dramatic. Delivered like a conclusion. "I think we've been patient enough," the jacketed man said, folding his papers. "Some people just aren't a good fit for leadership environments." The worker felt it then, not anger, not fear, but clarity. This was the line. The one meant to push him into reaction. To make him argue. Defend. Reveal something prematurely. He didn't. Instead, he lowered his gaze for a moment. Breathed once, slow and controlled. When he looked back up, his face was calm. Almost unreadable. The room waited. They expected emotion. Resistance. Collapse. What they got instead was silence, intentional, steady, and heavy enough to change the air. Because while they thought they had cornered a worker with no leverage left, they had misunderstood one critical thing. He hadn't been staying silent because he had nothing to say. He had been staying silent because timing matters. And the sentence he was holding was not meant for private meetings. The silence didn't break right away. It stretched. The kind of pause that makes people shift in their chairs, that pulls attention away from screens and notes and forces it onto the person everyone had underestimated. The worker stood there, hands still folded, eyes level now, not lowered, not defiant. Simply present. Someone cleared their throat. Another glanced toward the door. The jacketed man sensed it too. He straightened, adjusted his cuffs, and offered a thin smile meant to signal control. "If there's nothing further," he said, "we can conclude." "That won't be necessary." The worker's voice was calm. Even. Not loud enough to challenge authority, but clear enough to stop it. Every head turned. He didn't raise his chin. Didn't gesture. He spoke as if reading a line he'd rehearsed long before this moment, because he had. "I need the record to reflect that I'm a federally protected whistleblower assigned to this department under oversight review." One sentence. That was all. No explanation. No follow-up. No emotion. The air changed instantly. The jacketed man's smile vanished, not slowly, but all at once, as if it had been switched off. His hands froze mid-motion. For the first time since anyone could remember, he didn't speak right away. Across the table, someone's pen slipped from their fingers and clattered softly to the floor. No one bent to pick it up. "Excuse me," someone whispered, not to the worker, but to the room. The worker remained still. That single line began unfolding in people's minds, piece by piece. Federally protected. Oversight. Assigned. Not a complaint. Not a threat. An established fact. A woman near the window slowly lowered her notebook. Another participant leaned back, eyes narrowing, not at the worker, but at the man who had just been speaking with so much confidence. The jacketed man swallowed. Once. Then again. "That's not something we were informed of," he said finally, forcing a light tone that cracked at the edges. The worker met his gaze. Didn't challenge the lie. Didn't correct it. Silence did the work for him. A phone buzzed on the table. Ignored. A chair creaked. Someone shifted closer to the exit. The observers, the ones brought in to watch him, were no longer watching him at all. Their attention had pivoted, slow and unmistakable, toward the jacketed man. "What oversight body?" one of them asked, carefully. The worker answered with a name. Just a name. Nothing more. The effect was immediate. Faces tightened. Brows furrowed. A few people exchanged looks that said, "We need to pause this." Someone quietly closed a laptop. Another stopped taking notes altogether. The jacketed man's confidence began to drain visibly. His posture collapsed inward by degrees. The authority he had wielded so casually minutes earlier now sat awkwardly on his shoulders, heavy and ill-fitting. He tried to recover. "Well," he said, laughing once, too loudly, "that certainly changes the context." It did more than that. It reversed it. The worker said nothing else. He didn't need to. The room had crossed an invisible line, and everyone there knew it. The accusations. The selective enforcement. The public humiliation. All of it reframed in an instant, not as management, but as exposure. The silence that followed wasn't obedience. It was calculation. And the aftershock had only just begun. No one spoke at first. Not because they were unsure what to say, but because they were suddenly very aware of how much had already been said. The jacketed man shifted in his chair, then shifted again, as if trying to find a position that still fit him. His authority had depended on momentum. On the assumption that no one would ever stop the meeting and ask why. That assumption had just evaporated. One of the external observers cleared his throat. Slowly. Deliberately. "For the record," he said, eyes no longer on the worker, "this changes how today's session is categorized." Categorized. The word landed like a stamp. Another observer leaned forward. "We'll need to pause any evaluative commentary until compliance verification is complete." The jacketed man opened his mouth, then closed it. He nodded too quickly. "Of course. Naturally. Transparency is important to us." No one mirrored the nod. Across the table, a woman who had laughed weeks earlier now stared at her notes as if they might protect her. Someone else crossed their arms, realizing too late that folded arms no longer looked confident, only defensive. The worker remained standing. He didn't smile. Didn't look relieved. Didn't look vindicated. That unsettled them more than anger would have. A phone rang. This time, someone answered. "Yes," the observer said quietly. He listened. His eyes lifted toward the jacketed man, not accusing, just attentive. "Understood." He ended the call. "We're suspending this review," he announced. "Effective immediately." A chair scraped sharply as someone stood without meaning to. Another person inhaled too fast, then forced a steady breath. The jacketed man laughed again, softer this time. "I think we're getting ahead of ourselves." "No," the observer replied, calm and firm. "We're getting exactly where we should have been." Silence followed. Then came the questions. Not shouted. Not dramatic. Quiet, but precise. Who authorized the selective audits? Why was documentation withheld? Why were remarks made in open session about an individual under protected status? Each question peeled away another layer. The jacketed man answered some, dodged others. His voice grew thinner with every sentence. The language shifted from command to explanation, from confidence to caution. At one point, he glanced at the worker. Not with hostility. With something closer to disbelief. As if only now realizing that the man he had dismissed for months had never been reacting, only observing. A staff member at the far end of the table stood. I'd like to clarify something, she said, hands shaking just slightly. Those instructions came directly from. She stopped herself. Looked at the jacketed man. Finished the sentence anyway. The room absorbed it. That was the moment the balance tipped fully. What had been individual discomfort turned collective realization. People began to speak, not loudly, but honestly. Small admissions. Careful corrections. Statements offered not to help the worker, but to protect themselves. The worker listened. He noticed everything. The way one man avoided his eyes entirely. The way another offered a weak, belated nod. The way silence now followed every word spoken by the jacketed man. Eventually, an announcement came. An internal review. An external audit. A temporary reassignment of leadership responsibilities. No shouting. No escort. Just consequences delivered with bureaucratic calm. The jacketed man gathered his papers slowly. His hands trembled now, just enough to notice. As he stood, his chair tipped slightly, unsteady. He steadied it himself. No one helped. For the first time, he looked small. As he reached the door, he turned back, as if to say something, to reclaim dignity, or control, or narrative. Nothing came out. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The sound echoed louder than any argument could have. Only then did the room look back at the worker. Not as a subject. Not as a problem. As a presence. One of the observers spoke carefully. You handled this, professionally. The worker inclined his head once. That was the goal. Another pause. Then a quiet ripple moved through the room, not applause, not approval, but something deeper. Recognition. Because everyone there understood now, they hadn't just witnessed a correction of process. They had watched power misjudge silence. And lose. The worker finally sat down. Not because he was told to, but because the moment, this moment, was complete. Justice hadn't arrived with noise. It had arrived with truth, timing, and the restraint to let others undo themselves. The room didn't return to normal after that. It couldn't. Meetings ended early. Conversations softened. Titles that once carried weight now sounded tentative when spoken aloud. The worker noticed the shift immediately, not in dramatic gestures, but in small ones. Doors held open. Questions asked instead of assumptions made. His name spoken with care. An email arrived later that afternoon. It was brief. Formal. It confirmed what everyone already knew: leadership duties had been reassigned pending investigation. External oversight was active. All related evaluations were voided. No apology was written. None was needed. The correction itself was the acknowledgement. In the days that followed, people approached him quietly. Some offered thanks. Others offered explanations that sounded suspiciously like excuses. He listened without judgment. Responded politely. He didn't collect apologies like trophies. That had never been the point. What mattered was that the pressure was gone. The weight he'd been carrying, silently, deliberately, had finally been lifted in public view. Not because he demanded it, but because the truth, once placed on the table, made denial impossible. His role didn't change. His authority did. When he spoke now, no one interrupted. When he raised a concern, it was documented. When decisions were made, his presence was requested, not out of fear, but respect. And that respect carried farther than the room. The lesson traveled quietly through hallways and inboxes and meetings where people thought before they spoke, where power hesitated just long enough to remember it wasn't absolute. For the worker, the victory wasn't about seeing someone fall. It was about never having to shrink again. He still arrived early. Still left late. Still did the work with the same discipline that had always defined him. But now, when he stood with his hands folded, it wasn't misread as submission. It was understood as control. Because silence is not the absence of strength. Sometimes, it is the container for it. And one sentence, spoken at the right moment, in the right room, can redraw every line of power people thought was permanent. That is how truth wins. That is how power falls. And that is how justice speaks, without ever needing to raise its voice.